On a cold gray afternoon in the heart of the city, Daniel Hayes, a hard-working single father, was rushing to pick up his daughter from daycare when the skies opened up. With only a threadbare umbrella in hand and a worn coat clinging to his back, he was the image of a man quietly fighting through life. His days were a blur of early mornings at a warehouse and late nights washing dishes, all for the bright smile of his 5-year-old daughter, Lily. That day, however, fate had other plans. Just outside a crowded crosswalk, Daniel noticed a young woman standing alone, shivering in the downpour. Her heels were soaked, her designer coat drenched, and her expression one of quiet panic. Without thinking twice, Daniel stepped beside her and held the umbrella over her head, offering her shelter without a word. It was a moment so small, so fleeting, that he never expected to see her again. But for Celeste Monroe, that moment changed everything. What Daniel didn't know was that Celeste wasn't just another stranger. She was the heiress to a sprawling estate, running from a life that felt more like a prison than a privilege. And the man who shared his umbrella that day, he reminded her of something she'd lost long ago: genuine kindness. This is not just a story of chance, but of transformation. From that single gesture of humanity bloomed an extraordinary journey, one that would lead Daniel from a modest apartment to a mansion he never asked for, and from loneliness to a love neither of them saw coming. The day had started like any other, in the city hustle and horns, footsteps echoing against pavement slick with the memory of last night's drizzle. The kind of gray, overcast morning that made people rush faster, heads ducked low, jackets pulled tight. But by mid-afternoon, the skies could no longer hold back. A sudden downpour crashed down with a fury that caught even the most seasoned commuters off guard. Rain slammed against glass windows, streamed along gutters, and pooled in the cracked sidewalks. Traffic snarled as windshield wipers flailed. Strangers huddled beneath awnings or raced for the nearest overhangs. And in the middle of it all, Daniel Hayes was running, shoulders hunched, shoes soaked, and umbrella barely holding its shape. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who had time for storms. His life was a storm already. Since his wife passed away 3 years ago, he'd been moving in survival mode. Early mornings were spent lifting crates at a warehouse on the edge of town, afternoons cleaning offices, and evenings doing dishes in the back of a diner just to make rent. What kept him going was Lily, his daughter, his light, his reason for pressing forward, no matter how heavy the burden. 5 years old and full of questions, she didn't yet understand why her daddy looked so tired every night, or why they couldn't afford the same toys and clothes the other kids had. But she never complained. She just wrapped her arms around him, told him he was the best daddy in the world, and in that moment, everything he endured felt worth it. As the rain thickened into a curtain of water, Daniel tightened his grip on the umbrella, old bent thing he'd found in a thrift store bin months ago. He was late. Lily's daycare would close soon, and he still had 3 blocks to go. He passed shops with shuttered doors, watched as umbrellas flipped inside out in the wind, and nearly stumbled on the slippery curb. But then, just before the light turned at a crosswalk, something or someone caught his attention. She stood alone, wrapped in a cream-colored coat, now soaked through and clinging to her arms. Her shoes, clearly expensive, were dark with water, and her expression hovered between frustration and helplessness. Most people passed her without a second glance, absorbed in their own wet misery. But Daniel, despite everything else on his mind, paused. Something about her looked out of place, not just her clothes, but the quiet panic in her eyes. Without thinking, he stepped beside her, lifted his battered umbrella, and held it over her head. She turned in surprise, blinking rain from her lashes. "You'll get drenched," he said, his voice soft but steady, "at least until the light changes." She looked at him as if unsure whether to accept the kindness or politely refuse it. Then she nodded. They stood in silence as the storm raged around them, bound together for a few fleeting moments by nothing more than shared shelter. When the light turned green, Daniel gave her a small smile, nodded again, and stepped off the curb, vanishing into the sea of umbrellas. She never asked his name, but she couldn't forget his face. And as the rain poured down harder, soaking her to the bone even after he left, Celeste Munro felt something stir in her chest, a moment of warmth in the cold. A simple kindness that broke through everything else. She had no way of knowing who he was, but she knew this. She had to find him. Daniel Hayes never expected his life to look like this. Years ago, when he married Emma, he believed they were on their way to something solid. She was a nurse, kind and steady, with a laugh that calmed storms. He worked construction, then long days, yes, but they had plans. A home, a garden, a future for the kids they dreamed of. But life had its own ideas. When Emma got sick, everything changed. Medical bills drained their savings. Daniel sold the car, then the house, moving into a modest 2-bedroom apartment near the edge of town. When she passed, it left a silence that never fully lifted. And with Lily still in diapers, Daniel had to learn to carry the weight of 2 parents at once. He never complained. That wasn't his way. But the strain etched lines into his face, turning his posture into a permanent hunch. There were no vacations, no lazy Sundays, no nights off. Just bills to pay, shoes to buy before Lily outgrew them, and jobs to chase before someone else took them first. He worked like a man, always one misstep away from collapse. And still, he smiled when Lily greeted him with those sleepy morning hugs or proudly showed him her stick figure drawings taped to the fridge. She was his anchor, his reason. That day, as he rushed through the rain, the thought of her waiting at the daycare tugged at his chest. He hated being late. She worried easily, always asking if he'd forgotten her or if something had happened. And he could never quite explain that sometimes things just didn't work out the way you planned. Not in a world where buses ran late, shifts dragged on, and your shoes had holes in the soles. Still, he ran, umbrella jerking with every gust of wind, not out of duty, but out of love. He didn't think twice about stopping for the woman at the crosswalk. That's just who he was. Daniel couldn't fix much in the world, but if he could give someone a few dry seconds, he would. He hadn't seen her before, didn't recognize the brand on her soaked coat or the delicate watch around her wrist. He didn't ask why someone like her was out alone in the storm. He just offered shelter, gave her the comfort he wished someone had offered him on his worst days. And then he was gone, weaving through traffic, cutting across alleys, making it just in time to scoop Lily into his arms before the last caregiver locked the doors. She giggled as he swung her up, her tiny hands patting his cheeks. "You're all wet, Daddy," she squealed. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time that day. "So are you, Bug." They walked home together, splashing in puddles, umbrellas barely shielding them from the storm. And though he didn't realize it, the woman he'd helped was standing blocks away, staring in the direction he'd gone. Her world was about to shift, and so was his. Celeste Munro hadn't planned to be out in the storm. Her driver had dropped her off downtown for a charity event she never actually intended to attend. Lately, she'd been slipping away from her obligations more and more, stealing pockets of anonymity wherever she could find them. No security detail, no branded clothing, no one fussing over her last name or legacy. Just herself. For years, she'd moved through life as if playing a role someone else had written. The daughter of a hotel magnate, the face of the Monroe Foundation, the heiress with the golden future. But behind all the wealth and headlines was a woman quietly drowning in her own loneliness. When the rain started falling that day, she'd been browsing through a used bookstore, trying to find something that reminded her of simpler times. The clerk had just handed her a dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre when thunder cracked like a warning. She stepped out onto the sidewalk just as the skies opened, her coat offering little protection and her flimsy heels slipping against the wet stone. Within seconds, she was drenched, surrounded by a flood of rushing bodies who didn't care who she was or where she came from. And that anonymity, once so precious, became terrifying. She tried to hail a cab, but they were all full. Her phone buzzed with missed calls from her assistant, but she ignored them. For a moment, she felt entirely abandoned, like a ghost walking through a city that didn't see her. Then, through the blur of rain, a figure appeared beside her. Quiet, unassuming, carrying an umbrella that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't hesitate. He simply lifted the umbrella and held it over her. She looked at him, really looked. There was something rugged about him, not just in appearance, but in presence. A tired man with kind eyes. He didn't smile much, but there was a gentleness in the way he shifted the umbrella more toward her, even though it meant getting himself wetter. No one had shown her that kind of selflessness in a long time. Most people around her gave because they wanted something back, but this man, whoever he was, expected nothing. Then he was gone. No dramatic goodbye, no attempt to get her name, just a nod, a glance, and the sound of his footsteps fading into the storm. Celeste stood there long after the light changed, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't quite name. She felt like she'd been handed something more than just shelter. For the first time in years, someone had seen her, not the heiress, not the headline, just her. She whispered to herself, "Who was that?" And she meant it with everything in her. That brief moment beneath the umbrella played over and over in Celeste's mind for the rest of the evening. She sat by her bedroom window in the towering Monroe estate, wrapped in a plush robe, sipping tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the storm had quieted to a gentle drizzle, but inside, her thoughts were louder than ever. She couldn't stop thinking about the man at the crosswalk. Not just his kindness, but his presence, the way he carried himself, the tired heaviness in his eyes that somehow still made space for grace. There was something strangely intimate about the shelter they shared. No introductions, no small talk, yet it had felt more real than any conversation she'd had in months. And for all the people in her orbit, publicists, partners, family, friends, none of them had made her feel as human as that man with the ragged umbrella. The interaction had been brief, yet it lingered like a melody she couldn't forget. She told herself it was nothing, a moment of decency, a fluke, but deep down, she knew better. In a world where most people looked past her or looked at her for the wrong reasons, he hadn't looked through her. He had simply offered shelter. That was all, and that was everything. She stared out into the city, wondering where he was now. Was he warm and dry? Did he have someone waiting at home? What did he do when he wasn't offering umbrellas to strangers in the rain? These questions became companions to her silence. Her staff assumed she was just tired from the rain, that the storm had put her in one of her moods again. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled her, it was the clarity that followed it. That night, she made a decision. Not impulsive, not reckless, but certain. She needed to find him. Not out of curiosity, but because something deep in her heart had shifted. The kind of shift that tells you you've just walked past a moment that matters and you can't let it slip away. The following days unfolded like a hazy dream for Celeste. Life resumed its usual pace: meetings with investors, appearances at charity galas, long emails from distant relatives, asking for favors they disguised as opportunities. She moved through it all with practiced poise, smiling for cameras, offering quotes to the press, but her mind wasn't present. It was with him, with the man who'd given her shelter in the rain. She didn't know his name, he hadn't offered it, and she hadn't asked. But she remembered his face with vivid clarity, the weariness behind his eyes, the kindness etched into the lines of his expression, the deep voice that had offered her comfort without asking for anything in return. She remembered the way he held the umbrella slightly tilted toward her, as if his own comfort mattered less than hers. These fragments stayed with her, like the ghost of a song she once knew but couldn't fully hum. Celeste tried to tell herself it wasn't worth the effort. The city was massive, teeming with people, and he had probably moved on, forgotten her the moment he stepped away. He was just a working man caught in the rain, not some hidden prince in disguise. But still, she couldn't let it go. Something about that encounter stirred a longing in her, not for romance, not yet, but for connection, for something real. She began to scan the streets more attentively on her drives through the city. She visited that same crosswalk several times, lingering nearby, under the pretense of waiting for a ride. She even walked into a few coffee shops and bookstores in the area, casually asking if anyone recognized the description of a man with a kind smile and a threadbare umbrella. Most people just shook their heads. But then one afternoon, as she sat at a corner cafe nursing a lukewarm espresso, she caught sight of a familiar silhouette on the other side of the street. Her breath caught. It was him. Same broad shoulders, same quiet stride, same umbrella tucked under one arm, despite the sunny sky. She didn't call out, didn't rush over. She watched as he paused in front of a daycare, waited at the door, and moments later, lifted a small child into his arms. She's daughter, judging by the way she wrapped around him like home. Celeste leaned back in her seat, heart pounding. She hadn't imagined him. He was real. And now, she had something more than a memory. She had a path. For Daniel Hayes, the days after the rainstorm were no different from any other. Wake up before dawn, brew the weakest coffee money could buy. Prepare Lily's lunch, making sure to cut her sandwich into heart shapes like her mom used to. Then hurry her through breakfast, wrap her in her pink puffy jacket, and rush her to daycare before clocking in at his first job. His life moved on, but that moment in the rain stayed tucked in the back of his mind like an old photograph, unexpected, oddly warm, and strangely comforting. He didn't think it meant anything. The woman had looked like she didn't belong on that sidewalk, not because she was lost, but because everything about her shimmered with quiet wealth. He noticed the coat, the delicate gold around her wrist, the polish in her posture. She didn't speak much, just gave him a grateful look that stayed with him longer than he admitted. But Daniel wasn't the type to dwell on things like that. He had bills to worry about. Lily's growing feet needed new sneakers. The landlord had mentioned raising rent again. And the diner had started cutting hours. He didn't have time for curiosity about mysterious women in the rain. Still, he couldn't forget her. Not entirely. Not the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. Not the way she stood so still under the umbrella, as if it was the first time in a long time she didn't have to hold herself up alone. It was strange, feeling like he'd given something to someone who clearly had so much more. But that's what kindness was, wasn't it? Giving what little you had, just because you could. And so Daniel went on with his routine. Warehouse in the mornings, offices in the afternoons, the diner 3 nights a week. He read bedtime stories to Lily, fixed what he could in their aging apartment, and tried to make her laugh as much as possible, even on days he came home limping from work. He didn't know someone had seen all of it, that someone had followed the quiet rhythm of his world from a distance, watching with eyes full of wonder. Celeste Monroe was watching, and every day that passed, her resolve deepened. He had saved her, not from the storm, but from the emptiness of her life, and she intended to return the favor. Celeste Monroe lived in a mansion with chandeliers that sparkled like starlight and walls lined with paintings older than her great-grandfather. She dined with world leaders, donated to global causes, and graced magazine covers with the kind of elegance that came effortlessly, but none of it ever felt like hers. Every smile she gave the camera was rehearsed. Every charity event was a performance, a display of control and grace and status. But beneath the designer gowns and perfect posture lived a woman who often stood in front of her own mirror and wondered what it would be like to just disappear. Her parents had passed when she was still in college, both gone within the same year. She inherited everything: the hotels, the board seats, the responsibility. But with it came a loneliness too vast to explain. Friends became strategic allies. Love became transactional. She couldn't trust people to see her anymore. They saw the name, the bank account, the doors she could open. Not one of them ever asked how she slept at night, or if she even did. That's why that moment in the rain had pierced her so deeply. Daniel didn't know who she was, and he didn't care. He had offered kindness like it was instinct, not calculation. For the first time in years, someone treated her like a person, not a title, and it changed something in her. It wasn't about the umbrella. It was about being seen. So she began to slip away more often, disguised in plain clothes, hair tucked under a cap. She wandered the parts of the city she'd once passed by without noticing. She visited the daycare, waited near the diner, learned the pattern of his days, not to invade his privacy, but to understand the world he lived in. It humbled her, broke down walls she didn't realize she had built. She saw how hard he worked, how patient he was with his daughter, how he said thank you to waitresses and janitors. She noticed the small things, The way he always took the stairs instead of the elevator, likely to save electricity at home. The way he stopped to fix a fallen trash bin even when he was late. He was nothing like the men in her world, men who talked too much about themselves and gave too little. And quietly, without meaning to, she began to fall into something more than admiration. It wasn't until the third week of her quiet observation that Celeste made her first real move. She had been waiting across the street from the daycare, hidden behind a rack of potted plants at the florist's shop. She'd come every afternoon, sometimes with coffee in hand, sometimes with a small notebook in her purse filled with scribbled thoughts she'd never show anyone. She had no plan, not really. But that day, something changed. Daniel exited the daycare with Lily bouncing in his arms, her giggles lighting up the block. Celeste smiled as she watched them, her heart swelling at how gently he brushed his daughter's damp curls away from her face. He set her down and took her small hand in his, starting toward the grocery store. Celeste followed, careful to stay on the other side of the street. But halfway down the block, a car backfired loudly, and Lily jumped, startled. Daniel knelt immediately to comfort her, and Celeste instinctively stepped off the curb, intending to cross, to help, to do something. He looked up. For a moment, their eyes met. Celeste froze. Recognition flickered across his face, confused but certain. He remembered her. Then Lily tugged his sleeve, and just like that, he turned away, distracted by his daughter's needs. Celeste stepped back onto the sidewalk, her heart pounding, pulse racing. That one look confirmed what she had hoped. He hadn't forgotten. The moment in the rain wasn't one-sided. It had left its mark on him, too. She exhaled, a trembling breath filled with more hope than she'd allowed herself in years. Now, the question was no longer if she would speak to him again. It was when. Celeste found herself returning to that neighborhood every chance she could. The cafes and corner stores, the cracked sidewalks and laundry lines, these weren't places she belonged, at least not on paper. But they became her sanctuary. Here, she wasn't at Monroe Hotels. She wasn't the woman with too many assistants and too few friends. She was just Celeste, slipping through the city with a borrowed name and a heart that beat faster every time she spotted Daniel in the crowd. She saw him differently than he saw himself. He walked like a man used to being overlooked, shoulders squared against judgment, eyes always scanning for what might go wrong next. He didn't wear his struggle on his sleeve, he carried it in his silence. But Celeste could see the way he lit up around Lily, how he reached for her hand every time they crossed a street, how he crouched to her level when she spoke, treating her every word like treasure. His devotion wasn't dramatic. It was constant, steady, unshakable. That's what struck Celeste the most, not the tiredness in his eyes, but the strength in them. He didn't complain, didn't broadcast his exhaustion to the world. He just did whatever needed doing. And he did it with quiet dignity. Watching him live this way without applause, without reward, humbled her in a way money never could. She thought about the world he returned to each night. The cramped apartment with creaky floors, the patched-up furniture, the fridge that probably hummed too loudly when it ran. And she knew instinctively that he had given her more with that umbrella than she could ever repay in kind. It wasn't just the shelter. It was the reminder that kindness still existed in unexpected places, often from people who had the least to spare. Celeste started writing again, not press releases or speeches, but letters. She never sent them. Just pages of thoughts she couldn't say, aloud reflections on the man she barely knew but couldn't stop thinking about. She wrote about the ache in his eyes, the way his daughter's laugh seemed to lift the air around them. She wrote about how that brief moment in the rain had changed her, softened her, opened a door she didn't even realize had been locked shut. One night, she sat by her window with a single question looping through her mind. What if I did something for him, not out of guilt, not out of pity, but out of gratitude, out of admiration? And then the idea came to her, wild and impossible, and far too personal for someone in her position. But it wouldn't let go. She was going to find a way to change his life, not to repay a debt, but to finally give back something real. It wasn't easy to track Daniel down without revealing who she was, But Celeste had resources, quiet ones. No PR teams or headlines. Just one trusted friend who worked in her foundation's real estate division. She asked him to look into a man named Daniel Hayes. All she knew was the daycare, a rough idea of his address, and that he worked multiple jobs. A few discreet calls later, she had enough to piece together his world. Single father, 2 part-time jobs, lives in an apartment that needed repairs years ago. Pays rent like clockwork, even when it hurts. She didn't want to come barging in like a benefactor. That wasn't what this was about. She wanted to give him breathing room, a break he would never ask for but so deeply deserved. So she thought long and hard about how to approach it, not as a stranger offering a handout but as someone who had once stood in the rain beside him and never forgot the warmth it gave her. It took her nearly a week to work up the courage. She waited outside the daycare again, holding a black umbrella, not the same one he'd shared, but one she'd bought just for today. He stepped out with Lily, and when he saw her, his brows furrowed in surprise. "I didn't expect to see you again," he said, cautious but polite. Celeste smiled gently. "I didn't expect to be here, but I never forgot what you did." He looked down at Lily, who was clinging to his pant leg, curious and shy. "I'd like to talk," Celeste continued, "if that's all right, about something that might help you, both of you." He didn't respond right away. She could see the gears turning, skepticism, maybe embarrassment, even a hint of pride. But finally, he nodded and gestured toward a nearby bench. They sat, and she told him everything. Not about who she was not yet, but about what he had shown her. That moment of kindness, how it had stayed with her, long after the storm passed. She told him she wanted to offer him and Lily a homia, real home, a house, a place with space to breathe, to grow, a fresh start, no strings attached. Daniel blinked at her, stunned. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she said softly. "I know that you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know that you love your daughter with your whole being. And I know that sometimes the people who give the most are the ones who are offered the least in return." For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. His mouth opened, but no words came. Celeste reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small envelope. Inside was a simple key and an address written in her delicate handwriting. "I won't be offended if you say no," she said, "but just think about it." She stood, gave Lily a small wave, and walked away before he could answer. Daniel sat there, holding the key, the weight of it heavier than anything he'd lifted in all his long, hard days. Daniel didn't sleep much the night she handed him the key. The envelope sat untouched on the table, its simple weight pressing down on his already anxious thoughts. He paced the apartment after Lily had gone to bed, glancing over at the cracked paint on the walls, the flickering kitchen light he hadn't had time to fix, the mattress sagging in the corner that he used as a makeshift couch. He wasn't ashamed of their life. He had worked for every inch of it. But something about that envelope, about the woman behind it, made him feel exposed in a way he couldn't explain. Part of him wanted to say no, not because he didn't need it, God, he did, but because accepting it meant admitting just how close to breaking he really was, and because he couldn't figure out her angle. What did she want from him? Why him? There were people in worse situations, people who'd gone through more. But as he sat at the table with his hands in his hair, trying to make sense of her kindness, he realized he already knew the answer. It wasn't about what he lacked. It was about what he had shown, even when he had nothing to give. So he took a breath, got Lily dressed, and went to the address the next morning. It was a modest home, bigger than their apartment, yes, but not a palace. It was warm, clean. Sunlight spilled across hardwood floors, and there was a little fenced backyard just right for a child to run free. Lily wandered from room to room in wide-eyed wonder, asking if they were dreaming. Daniel could only nod, overcome by the peace he didn't realize he had been missing. Celeste was waiting by the gate, hands folded, nerves visible for the first time. "You came," she said, her voice quiet, hopeful. "I had to," he replied. "I needed to see if it was real." She smiled, the tension slipping from her shoulders. "It's real, and it's yours. No conditions, no papers, just a gift. From someone who remembers what it's like to feel alone. Daniel looked at her for a long time then, seeing her not as the mysterious woman in the rain, but as someone carrying a loneliness not unlike his own. There was a softness in her eyes that came from experience, not sympathy. He saw her not the wealth, not the mystery, but the woman. And in that moment, something shifted. He didn't have the words for it, not yet. But his heart understood before his mind could catch up. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what I can ever give you in return." "You already did," Celeste whispered. "That day in the rain." And just like that, the space between them changed. No longer strangers, no longer alone. The weeks that followed unfolded like pages from a story Daniel never imagined he'd be part of. He moved into the house with Lily, and though he still worked, he couldn't give up his jobs just yet. There was a new rhythm to their days. They had breakfast at a real table. Lily had her own room for the first time, with walls she could tape her drawings to without the paint crumbling. She danced barefoot on clean floors, her laughter echoing through rooms that no longer felt empty. Celeste visited often, but never intrusively. Sometimes she brought books for Lily, or fresh bread from a local bakery. Other times she just sat on the porch with Daniel, the two of them sipping coffee and letting the silence stretch between them, not heavy, not awkward, just full of things unspoken. They learned from each other slowly, shared stories from the scars they carried. He told her about Emma, the love he'd lost. She told him about her parents, the life she'd inherited, and how none of it ever felt like her own. One spring afternoon, Daniel found a patch of wild roses blooming at the edge of the yard. He picked one, the petals soft and flushed pink, and handed it to Celeste with a smile that no longer held hesitation. "You gave us this," he said. She looked down at the flower, then back at him. "You gave me something too," she said. "You reminded me what it feels like to be seen and loved." The word hung there, fragile and terrifying. Loved. Neither of them had planned for this. It had started with a single umbrella, a small gesture on a rainy day, but it had grown into something steady and unexpected. A life neither of them thought they'd get a second chance at. They stood in the yard as Lily chased butterflies nearby, sunlight wrapping around them like a promise. Daniel reached for Celeste's hand. She didn't pull away. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping music or magic words. Just a man and a woman, two hearts once worn thin by grief and isolation, now beating in unison. And in that quiet, beautiful moment, love took root, soft as the rain, bold as a rose in full bloom.